Welcome to the Mentorlist, a source of sound advice with your host, David Lewis.
To seek support, and you need to allow yourself to be supported.
Really have a point of difference.
What is precious, what's really important, and then putting some boundaries there.
The Mentorlist specialises in interviews with top business minds. Gather their advice for your career. This is the Mentorlist.
Hello and welcome to today's show. Today we are having a conversation with Leigh Kelson, a web technologies veteran and Australian enterprise cloud computing pioneer. Leigh commenced his career in the technology sector in the mid-80s. Over the past 30 years, he has founded and or co-founded 10 companies in a diverse range of industries from biotech, web, entertainment and media. In the early 90s, he founded Pacific Rim Marketing, a first mover in digital marketing and customer loyalty programs. The company evolved into web development, early email marketing, and went on to pioneer cloud computing and marketing automation in Australia. That was in the early 2000s. He established the first Salesforce.com professional service practice in Melbourne. So PRM Cloud Solutions was then acquired by Persistent Systems in December 2015. Since then, Leigh has held board positions on both public and private held companies and been involved in 3 public listings and capital raising of over $100 million. So recently founded his passion project up in Paradise Point, which is where we will be crossing to his studio very, very shortly. So I hope you enjoy today's conversation with Leigh Kelson and future episodes, as Leigh has kindly nominated himself as the co-host of an exciting new miniseries we have coming up called the Mentorlist Global Ecosystems. So stay tuned, and I hope you enjoy today's conversation. Yeah, so Leigh, maybe for the listeners that haven't come across you before, did you want to share a little bit about your story?
Sort of early childhood. How far back do you want me to go?
So maybe we sort of start at where you are now. I mean, we've got 10 companies in 30 years, 3 public listings, Pacific Rim. I mean, you'd pick it, right? This is your time. Yeah,
well, look, I suppose where I am now is BeachCity. We're a media company. I suppose it started for me as a passion project to try and encourage particularly youth, but anyone that's got an entrepreneurial spirit, to legitimize it as a path to take, but also to prepare them with the skills that they're going to need on the journey of entrepreneurship. Because when you're on the platform and you decide you're going to step off, it's a tough gig and you need to be prepared. And I think the cornerstone skills are creative thinking, problem solving and critical thinking. And I suppose my experience was that maybe our education system wasn't really geared to be, educating that. There certainly are now, and there's certainly a lot of positive moves in that space. But so that's what it is, and it's social media, and it's about putting a spotlight on entrepreneurs and trying to share learnings from ecosystems around the world. We interview mentors, governments, investors, founders, startups. That's BeachCity.
That's a very short synopsis, so we might just dig in a little there, because I know you're also a mentor on the mentor list, and that's sort of how we came about finding out about each other. And active listener of BeachCity. And I can't remember the stat, but it was 1,200 interviews in various countries. What was that you were reeling off for? So
the team have done, we've got a very small crew, but we've done just short of 1,200 interviews over the last 12 months. And that's taken us to, Boulder, Silicon Valley, Hong Kong, Jakarta, Chiang Mai, Outback Australia, and throughout parts of regional Queensland over the last 12 months. They're all short, very short, social media friendly interviews. So we try to keep them to sort of 6 to 8 minutes. And it's really based around the idea that everybody's got a story and everybody's got experiences and lessons that they can share. And what better way than to sort of create that peer to peer. And we also find that if it's too long, the Gen Z millennials don't have the attention spans. So we try to keep it nice and short and sharp. But yeah, we've certainly created a lot of content, and we reach about 2 million people a month now. We average about 500,000 video views, and we're moving on to the next phase of our plan.
Yeah, I was excited to hear about that. And this is creating content, or I guess white labeling that interviewing. Maybe you tell this is what it was.
Well, yes, I think that probably it was one of those things where it wasn't I'm going to create a new startup or create a new business. It was more of a passion thing. I sold PRM Cloud Solutions, which was an enterprise cloud company in 2014. And after about 2 weeks of sitting around going, what am I going to do now? I sort of thought, well, where can I give back? How can I add some value? And I started doing a lot of pro bono work just with, early stage companies, but found that was very time consuming. There's only one of me and nobody wants to hear me all the time. So what about we go out and share other people's stories? So it came really from a passion of wanting to tell stories. And, I've always been a real people person, and I love hearing people's stories, and it was fun. I thoroughly enjoy it, and I've met some amazing people and traveled to some amazing places. But I suppose at some point you sort of say, well, it's all very well being fun, but it's got to be sustainable. How do you continue to do this, and how do you monetize it? And I suppose it's the entrepreneurial mind. You ultimately turn to, you got to monetize this in some way or another. So I see there's a lot of people creating content, which is great. And, like the Mentorlist and yourself creating content. How do we aggregate that? And then how do we curate that into a place that makes it easily accessible for people? And I think, the idea of the disintermediation of education sort of plays into that thinking a bit. How do we make education around entrepreneurial capability development available to anyone and everyone everywhere cost effectively, and so that they're not lumbered with ridiculous debts and things that they have to carry through their life? I think that's sort of where the passion came from, and now it is evolving into a business. And the white label idea is that because we started as BeachCity, we just go out and we just rock up to events and we'd pump out 80 interviews over 3 days at an event. And then we had a lot of customers that were sort of saying to us, well, can you do that same stuff but for us? And in the early days we were sort of going, well, no, because we're sort of doing, this is it's our channel. And I think there's probably, a lesson in that for me as well, because you're thinking about it in a certain way. You're thinking about it in terms of it's a channel, it's a page, it's a YouTube channel, it's a Facebook page, channel, whatever you want to call it, and that all the content is your content. And then if you sort of flip that around and go, well, we don't own the content. Do we really want to own the content? Is it important to own the content? And the answer I arrived at is probably not. When you sort of release the shackles of that mindset, all of a sudden it opens up all these other opportunities. You say, well, what about if we go out and create this content? One of the things I think that's been successful with BeachCity is that our content is engaged with and viewed. I mean, people watch it and they love the authenticity of it. And that, we try to be the antithesis of the corporate video. Overproduced, glossy, pinstripe suits. I've got a very strong view that if you're going to engage the Gen Z and the millennials, the idea, David, sort of manifested itself from the old MTV days, right? MTV revolutionized music, not only through the video component, but in the way that they engaged with that voice. There was a voice of a generation, and it's a cultural thing. So my observations, and especially, having traveled to numerous ecosystems around the world, is that this new generation, particularly the Gen Zs that are coming through, they're disengaging with the suit, the corporate lifestyle, the commute, the cubicle with the fluorescent light, and this idea of a linear path that we're going to take. Go to school, get an education, get a degree, go and get a corporate job for 25 years. I think those days coming to an end, and it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not Armageddon, but I certainly see that there are those trends where people are looking for alternatives. And now with the technology and the enablement of technology, people literally can be anywhere, work anywhere. And if you've got the skills and you do the job, you can be anywhere, work anywhere. And you see the rise of the digital nomads throughout the world in hotspots like Medellin in Colombia, Chiang Mai. There's an estimated 30 or 40,000 so-called digital nomads. A lot of them with highly educated, very skilled, and they do the work. I don't care that they're in
paradise. Yeah, with a lovely cost of living. Why not?
Well, yeah, but like everything, it all has its pros and cons. So but for those people, they have to essentially run a business in order to generate revenue and to maintain that lifestyle. And the same skills that are true to any entrepreneur, which is those problem-solving, critical thinking skills, apply to those people that are going to opt for that style of life.
And you mentioned before, too much just sort of step back into a bit of the history there. You mentioned stepping off platforms, and typically, when I interview what I call serial entrepreneurs, I don't know if you like that title or not, but
no, not really. No, yeah,
30 businesses across 10 businesses in 30 years. I'm mixing up my stats. Yeah, it's usually one of two categories. Either it was working for someone else that sort of didn't feel right or didn't sit right with you, or the other things like there's a higher calling or a purpose where you're just something's pulling you towards something else? And what was it that sort of made you sort of step off and continue?
For me, I feel that it was there was never an option for me. The idea of working for someone else just never occurred to me. I was always, I suppose, when I look back at my later high school days, I was always hustling. I was, getting old bike parts and creating bikes, chopper bikes, and then selling them, or collecting all the best footy cards and trading them up. And, I know that's probably a cliche for where a lot of entrepreneurs start, but that was where I started as well. And I worked out very quickly the currency of, a particular superstar football card that was very rare and what that was worth if I could trade it. And so always looking for ways to sort of create deals or business ideas, and always had business ideas. Found myself doing a lot of, navel gazing, I suppose is what I'd call it, thinking about what about this idea? What about that idea? I remember having this idea that one day we're going to be driving electric cars and there's going to need to be new stations because petrol won't be in anymore, and we're going to need electric charging stations so people can rock up and plug their car in. That was a random idea I had when I was about 20 years old. So it's never going to be a work for the man. In fact, I sort of coined myself as a bit unemployable in a way, particularly through the institution of corporates and big companies.
Yeah. And yeah, so why unemployable? Why would you say that?
Well, I say that a little facetiously because I think that when you have been doing your own thing as long as I have, the thing with me is that I've always trying to find solutions. I've always got to have a problem to solve. And that manifests itself into businesses sometimes, some that have worked and some that have been monumental failures. So I think when you have those moments of doubt as an entrepreneur and you go, well, why am I doing this again? Why am I putting my family through this again? Maybe I should just go and get a job. And then as I think through that, I go, yeah, maybe not. The idea of having someone to report to, the idea of having to check in, swipe the card. I remember going through one of the swipe card terminals at a large client I was working with, and I had a contract there for 8 weeks running a sales program, and they gave me the card to swipe through the turnstile and into the lift and everything else, and it sort of reminded me of that movie Gattaca. I don't know whether you've seen Gattaca. It's like that sort of that George Orwell-esque, vision of the future. And I suppose I've always probably been a little bit of an outlier in that regard, that, I'd see all these guys, people going into their desk, going into their cubicle, all dressed, all trying to outdo each other, all dressed identically the same, and then spending the rest of their career trying to stand out, which I always thought was that whole thing. It's just, to me, it's like, well, that's not going to work for me.
And do you see, I guess if you're looking at the stats out of uni, it's definitely suggesting that, 75% of people that are in university at the moment see themselves as self-employed when they finish, or, and following this entrepreneur path. And there's so many hubs starting out. It's almost trendy to be an entrepreneur now. And so I guess, is that different to when you were selling footy cards, or I guess one of your earlier businesses? Or
Well, completely different. There was no such thing as an accelerator. There was, venture capital. We're talking back in the early 80s. So, completely different. And even to the point of having access to, information. I left school in year 12 with the idea of doing a gap year and then going back and studying, because that's what you did. That's sort of almost how we've been programmed, right? And then we get a mortgage, and then we work for 35 years. And then hopefully, if our health is good enough by the time we retire, we get a caravan and go around Australia. It's this sort of scripted path. And I think, the education system and the banking system loves it that way, because that's what their business models rely on. So I think we've been sold a bit of a furphy. You look at where the Great Australian Dream come from, and I think the origination of the Great Australian Dream was a marketing campaign created by the banks.
Really?
I think it was the Commonwealth Bank that had a marketing campaign back in the 50s or something, when they first did a first subdivision. So I digress from your question, but yes, it's completely different to what it is now. But on the cautionary side of that, I fear that there is potentially going to be some, collateral damage, and we could end up with a really severe mental health problem from the party popper, let's all be startups and, wear startup t-shirts. As much as I want to encourage and I say entrepreneurially spirited, because I feel like it's more of a spirit that someone has around entrepreneurship rather than I'm an entrepreneur. And I've always felt uncomfortable with people calling themselves entrepreneur. I still feel uncomfortable even labeling myself, or when I feel like it's for somebody else to say that person is an entrepreneur as opposed to me saying I am. It's a bit like saying I am a genius. How weird would that sound, right? It's for somebody else to say that person is a genius, So I see that, I see this, the gold rush. It's like any gold rush. There's people that are selling pots and pans. They're coming from everywhere. The people see money being thrown around. Young people are jumping on the bandwagon and becoming startups. And it's a tough gig. It's a hard road. And we need to be telling people it needs to be balanced. I understand that. But we need to be having the conversation that the collateral damage of getting into business and not being prepared and not having the entrepreneurial capability, and you don't learn it sitting in a lecture theatre. I'm sorry to disappoint your listeners, but you're not going to get the skills in a lecture theatre. You are going to get it from the skin off your knees, banging your head into the wall, putting yourself out there, and it's practical capability that is the missing element, I think, in entrepreneurship. So if we aren't preparing our young people for that journey, and I use the metaphor of sort of stepping off the platform, it's that conscious decision, that's the path I'm going to take, that's fine. But just know that, relationships get damaged, families get impacted, you can lose money, and you can lose your mum and dad's money, and you can lose your mum and dad's house that they've just spent 30 years. This is serious stuff, right? So I just don't think I'm seeing enough of that or hearing enough of that conversation, which is concerning to me.
But even now, I guess just some further context, and we were having a chat sort of before we hit the record button, and we were using an analogy of, running through the long grass and snipers were sort of putting bullets in your general direction. Like, is this one going to get me? Is this one going to get me? It's interesting to hear that after, I'll stuff up the stat again, but I think it's 10 companies in 30 years and 3 of which have been listed. So, there's some real success stories, and you mentioned a couple of great failures as well. But it's interesting to hear after, that sort of success in those businesses that you're still sort of running through the long grass thinking, shit, is this one going to get me? Is this going to be the end? So, does it end or?
I think I've come to the conclusion that no, it doesn't. And much to my dismay, I thought, it's a really interesting thing. And I think you'll find that a lot of entrepreneurs that have gone through the process of, getting a successful business and then getting an exit, whatever it is, again, at the risk of being cliche, it's not about the money. What annoys me is that we hold people up on pedestals, and the single metric we use as their level of success is how much money they've got in the bank. And we've got this idea that it's some sort of a spectrum. On one end is success and, ridiculous wealth, and on the other end is failure. I've learned more on my entrepreneurial journey about the things that I've stuffed up and the things that I've done wrong, more so than I have ever out of anything that I've felt that has been moderately successful. And I think because it is ambiguous, like success, like that is something that is unique to each person. Somebody that decides they want to get on the journey, maybe they want to have a lifestyle business and they're passionate about meditation or they're passionate about helping and then it's the social entrepreneurship side, or you don't get up out of bed to make money. I can tell you that tends to be a byproduct. And I can say that with some experience because, I've had times when I've had no money. I've had times where, things are looking great on paper during the .com boom. Was looking pretty good. Wasn't looking.
You've mentioned a few times you've got this great analogy with a cigar and a Lincoln. Is that time?
Well, I use that as a metaphor to say that the thing that frustrates me is that people go, "Oh, that was a failure." We look at someone like Shoes of Prey, and that was a failure. In whose mind? The people that invested money, they failed because they didn't make any money, what did the founder learn? What did the founders learn from that? What do we understand more about those markets, those business opportunities now? How does our investment market now take the lessons from out of that? So yeah, I think it's the opportunity to take the lessons from it rather than the idea that something failed. It's just constantly building capability. Everything that I've done has been about building capability. So there's no failure or success, because the only thing we're measuring success on is how much money you've got in the bank or how much they're worth. And I don't think that an overweight man who looks like he's about to have a heart attack and his family don't talk to him anymore and he's divorced, but he's got $40 million is a success. I'm sorry, but that's just my view. So the example I used is that the time for, that reflection and that learning opportunity and that introspection is not at the height of, that feeling of success, because it's a feeling. Oh, I'm successful. The company got away and the stock price is up and, I've got $3 million worth of stock in that and, I'm successful. Well, if we're just using a single metric to measure it, and that is a financial one, well, maybe you could be argued that you are. But the time to be introspective is not the time when you're driving up Broadway in New York in a Lincoln Town car, smoking a Cuban cigar, popping champagne, saying, how good was that, right? It's not when you're sitting there saying, oh, I wonder if we could have done that better, or, whatever. It's the times when the stock tanks or the business doesn't go as you expected, or you have to lay people off, or those tough times, or where you miss the market, or you don't find the market fit, or you think you've got market fit, so you go and inject money into it too quickly. You put your foot on the pedal too quickly. All of those lessons and experience are gold to take into the next thing that you do.
Yeah, fantastic. And I mean, that's good advice in itself, but was there any advice you received, or I guess wish you received during your journey, which sort of stuck with you that you'd be open to sharing?
One of my great mentors, John Nicholson, used to always say to me, yeah, that's great, Leigh, but what's your distribution? And I'd say, well, we're going to go and sell, and we're going to, we've got this product and we're going to go and sell it, and we'll sell it to these people and we'll sell it to those people. And he'd say, yes, but what's your distribution? And he would always ask me that. And at first I didn't quite understand what he meant by that. It took me a while. Maybe I'm a slow learner, but I understand it now. What he means by that is, how do we leverage it? So I suppose it's a question of scale. Everybody's talking about, is it scalable? Is it scalable? It's got to be scalable, and you've got to scale, and you've got to scale fast. And I mean, that's another point that I know we touched on the other day in the increasing returns, economics and W. Brian Arthur, which I'd encourage your listeners to go and find that white paper. Did you ever read of that? Or
I haven't read it yet, but by the way you're talking about it, that's another show.
So, distribution. So that, what's your distribution? What channels can you use? What partnerships can you form? Who wants to solve the problem more than you do? If you can find somebody, if you're trying to solve a problem and you're creating a business and, by virtue of that, you're solving problems and you're trying to create a product that's going to solve a problem, what's the distribution? How are you actually going to leverage what you're doing, as opposed to just saying, we're just going to go and knock on doors and sell? So I think that was a good piece of advice. And another piece of advice I got was, probably wasn't a piece of advice, but it was from another one of my mentors who said to me years ago, making the money's the easy bit, keeping it's the hard part.
Sounds like and firsthand from that one.
And I've learned firsthand from that one. So I get what he means now, 30 years later.
Yeah, something I picked up through one of my other interviews was they mentioned that money problems don't go away. In fact, when you've got an abundance of money, your problem is where to put it. And so you've still got money problems. They're just different kinds of problems or challenges.
They are. I know that it's very easy for people to say, oh, yeah, that's what people that have got money say. But I have to agree with that. It's not only the problem. I suppose when you've lived off, fresh air sandwiches for 10 or 15 years trying to build a business, then you would think that, once the payday comes and you finally can pay your bills off and get rid of the credit card and put a bit of money in the bank, that all your problems are over. And yeah, okay, it's a nice problem to have, to what am I going to invest this in? But, you've also got the things that you can't control. And I think that's the thing that I try to emphasize to particularly early stage companies, you can't control financial meltdowns. You can't control currency crashes. You can't control, the housing crash. You've got to put your money in there and hope that they're going to be sustainable and that money is going to grow. And as we've seen over time, that isn't the case. We've seen numerous mining booms and busts. We've seen currency meltdowns. We've seen global financial crises. When you are building a business in those environments, they have an impact on your business, and there's nothing that you can do about it to some extent except to batten down the hatches and try and battle your way through it. So probably digress from your question, did I? But
yeah, it's good. I was just listening in. I can't remember where we started. I think it was your second mentor. Yeah, it was the
keeping the money. But I think you might have asked me another question after that. Yeah. But I think it's a pretty important point that I just made, is that there are things that are outside of your control, and that there's nothing that you can do about it. And if you're in a sector, if you're in the property sector during the global financial crisis, and you had all of your money tied up in investments there, and you just spent 15 years building a business and selling it to exit, and then you've invested it in what's supposedly going to be a safe, nice return, risk-free investment, well, you just watched your money evaporate up overnight. So there's that sort of, the problem is, the fear is, what happens if I lose it all and my investments don't go as I planned and I have to start all over again? Then there's that fear of, God, could I do
failure? Still there, even when you've got the money in the bank. So
there you go. That's exactly right. It's still that sense of that fear that, again, you can't account for every possible variable or every possible eventuation when you're putting together a business plan or trying to build a business, because there's things that you can't control.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thanks for that. And thanks for sharing. Yeah, I guess your mentors are sort of scaling through you with the advice and out to the listeners. Just another share, if there's a book that you'd recommend people pick up, maybe one that's had an impact for you.
I think there's been probably a couple of books. Books are interesting because I think that I've read books at certain times of my life where I've either been, trying to start a business, or I've seen an idea for a business, and I've read a book and there's just one thing in that book that jumps out at me. I read many years ago In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters. It was an all-time bestseller. It's an oldie now, but it's a goodie. I'm pretty sure in there was a story of Stewie Leonard, and Stewie Leonard had Leonard's grocery store. And he reimagined what it meant to be a supermarket. And, supermarkets typically believed in the old, range and threshold. People won't travel more than a kilometre to get a carton of milk, but they might, travel 100,000 kilometres if they're going to purchase a Rolls Royce, for example. And what Stewie Leonard was able to do was turn his supermarket store up in Connecticut, outside of New York, into a destination where people would go there and spend hours there. And he was able to get the time they spent there. He was able to get higher basket prices. He was getting people traveling from hundreds of kilometres on a Saturday morning to come to his store. It was just it was a complete phenomenon. And he only ever had, I believe, 2 or 3 stores at the time. And I think at the time he only actually had 1 store. But the thing that he did was he asked his customers what they wanted.
Yeah, right.
Novel idea. But back then, it was a revelation. Like, well, let's ask them what they want. And they wanted wider aisles so that they could get their prams and the kids down the aisles. So he widened the aisles. They didn't want bread in packets. So he put in a fresh bakery. Instead of seal wrapping all the fish in foam containers and sealed, they wanted fresh so that they could see the seafood. So he put it all on ice. He created a board, and his board was made up of his customers. And he had a suggestion box, and they would put suggestions in, and then it'd go up to the board to the customers, and they would make the decision. So everything he did was built around what the customer wanted, and the success was phenomenal. So he was the guy that coined the phrase, rule number 1's the customer's always right, and rule 2, if the customer's ever wrong, refer to rule 1. And it's actually chiseled into stone out the front of the Stewie Leonard store in Connecticut. Amazing story, and there's other great stories in that In Search of Excellence book. But that had a real impact on me, that story of Stewie Leonard. And then the other one I think worth noting is Long Tail, The Long Tail by Chris Anderson. I think he was the ex-editor of Wired magazine, and he talks about the movement from the mass marketing to the niche marketing, and talking about the long tail. I know the long tail's sort of become a bit of a buzzword, but I think that's where it was originated from, but just an amazing book. And if you are trying to, understand markets and trying to work out where your product fits and get a broader perspective of what the internet means and what the fragmentation of the media markets and how that impacts where we are today and where we're going to be in the future. I think it probably 15 years old now, that book, but that's definitely one that I thought was just fascinating.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks very much for sharing. And yeah, I love the quote out of Tom Peters' book, and probably a good segue. And I gave you some pre-warning that I'd ask you for one of your favourite quotes. So did you manage to distill it down to one or a couple?
Probably my favourite quote was actually by Aristotle. And the quote was that anyone can become angry. That is easy. But to be angry with the right person and to the right degree and at the right time and for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not easy.
Right. I like it. It's actually, I was just listening to it tail off and I forgot to write it down. I'll listen back and I'll write it down. I'll pop that up online. That's a great one. Love it. And just sort of one final question, because we're kind of on the home stretch and I know you've got to get out of here. It's just around habits. So was there any habits that you've picked up or that you've ditched that you'd like to share with listeners that you've seen help you in your own mission?
Yeah, I think there is one major one. I suppose in my younger days, I've always worked hard, played hard, like a party. And in my 20s, we had a lot of fun as young single people. I was in the music industry at that stage. It was party hard. You can imagine what the music industry is like.
I'm getting you, man. It's a good time.
So I sort of decided that I was either going to die or leave the music industry. So I got out of that, but then I sort of got involved in the dot-com period in the early 90s and then, right through to the late 90s and early 2000s. And that was a pretty heady ride. That was pretty exciting times, that 10-year block from sort of 92, I suppose, to, 2001, 2002 after the crash. But in the early days of that, the first websites and the emergence of the proliferation of email and then into the early web development where we're seeing, all of the consumer-facing websites and the dot-com boom and, having sort of lived through all of that and then spent some time in New York, it was party central. It was drinking, it was eating and burning the candle at both ends. And after the dot-com crash, and then, you lose all your money and you start to go, okay, well, I've got to rebuild here. And, I think we've normalised our drinking culture, and particularly in Australia. It's like, oh, that's what you do. So I started getting quite a bit of anxiety and I started feeling quite depressed, and I started reading sites, getting information, researching why was I feeling like this. And, the things were sort of saying, I'm distilling it down here, but it was like, take a pill and keep doing what you're doing or change your lifestyle. Right. And so I opted to change my lifestyle. And so I thought, how am I going to do this? So I thought, well, I'll give up drinking for a week and then see how I go. And like most people, you feel so good at the end of the week of not drinking that you go and have a great time celebrating the fact that you've had a week off the drink. Sort of counterproductive. So then I thought, well, okay, I'll go through for another month. And I thought, well, I'll get through this month. And then I started going to the gym, and I was doing a lot of cycling when I was younger, and I started getting back on the bike. So, well, if I can get through a month, I can get through to Christmas. Or actually it was when the Round the Bay in a Day ride was on in Melbourne. And so it was 250-kilometre ride. And I thought, I'll train for that. I'll get to that. And once I've done that, I'll have a crownie and, that'll be my celebration. And by the time I finished that ride, I was that smashed. The last thing I felt like doing was having a crown lager, I can tell you. So I basically got home, crawled out of the shower and crashed. And then when I woke up the next morning, I realised that I hadn't had my drink for my goal. And I thought, well, bugger it, I'm going to go and see if I can get through to Christmas. My family, typical, like I suppose most families get together at Christmas. We eat a lot, we drink a lot, we have a great time, all that. But I did think that if I could get through to Christmas, so it was just these little sort of steps. I never consciously said I'm going to stop drinking, but I got through Christmas. And by the time I got through Christmas, which was the toughest Christmas I've ever had, I can tell you, I got through it and I thought, if I can get through Christmas, I can get through everything. And so I thought I'm going to go a year. So I set myself a goal for a year, and that was coming up to 14 years ago that I haven't had a drink.
Wow, fantastic.
And I couldn't believe how productive conferences were. I understand what the early bird breakfast networking meetings are now. But in all seriousness, the thing that you get back is time. That's the thing that amazes me. And people ask me, but don't you miss having a drink? And, it's so far in a distant lifetime now that no, I don't. But I feel like I've got a competitive advantage. I feel like I'm clearer in thinking. I've got more time on my hands. And so that led me to take up, get back into my music, which, I've been passionate about all my life, and, had the guitars locked in the cupboard, but they came out. I got the paint and the easel out. My wife thought I was going crazy, but I had to do things to fill the time in. And then I actually did this exercise, which I worked out the time that, and this was probably at my 10-year anniversary. I was just, in reflection thinking, wow, my mate's in my 20s. If you had said to them, Kelson will be off the grog by the time he's 40, they wouldn't have believed you. But I did the calculation, and my thinking here was, I can't burn the candle at both ends and build this business. I've got to focus on this business, and I've got to put all my energy into that. And while I'm sort of, going out and having a nice time and burning that candle at both ends, it's just something's going to give. My health's going to give, or something's going to give. So that was really the motivation. But the time was like, I said, okay, so if I was, Friday night, go out, there's 4 hours of drinking, then there's the hangover, which is probably 4 or 5 hours of hangover. And I just added it all up. And then I added it up over the months and over the 10 years, the amount of time that I had either spent drinking, preparing to drink, or having a hangover. Well, I can't remember what the number was, but it was mind blowing. It was 20,000 hours or something stupid like that.
Yeah. My God. Amazing.
And let me say, like, people say to me, but you weren't an alcoholic, were you? Which I always find a bit of an amusing question. No more than the bloke next door, right?
Yeah. Very true. That's all right. Yeah. All right. I'm speechless. Wow. Great habit. Almost by accident. But yeah, I can see by your face, you're so glad and to this day. What'd you say?
Mate. Probably one of the hardest things I ever did, because you lose the social circles a bit, and people stop inviting you out because, you're the boring guy that's going to drink Diet Coke in the corner. But the upside of it, and, how I had, like, it's probably one of the hardest things that I ever did, probably up there with my marriage and my birth of my children, and it's up there with one of the best things I've ever done.
Yeah, awesome. Wow. Thanks for sharing. I guess that's sort of, we're out of questions, and I know we're kind of out of time because we've got to get you on the road and out of your studio. But just wanted to sort of, thanks for coming on the show, and just for the listeners, they're going to get to experience your voice and humour and insights a little bit more as we kick off the Global Ecosystems mini-series. So yeah, watch out for Leigh hosting some great talks with some people coming up in the subsequent episodes. But yes, so Leigh, if people are trying to, find out a little bit more about you, or want to come and ask you some questions about your business and what you're doing, how do they go about finding you?
Probably LinkedIn is the best place, but, don't believe everything you read on LinkedIn either.
Okay, got it.
But yeah, I think LinkedIn, ping me on LinkedIn, that's probably the easiest. And then, if you want to have a message offline, we can go onto email or whatever, but that's probably the easiest.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's certainly how I came to be in conversation with you as well. So very effective means. Yeah, so thanks again, Leigh. And for everyone tuning in, tune in again next week with Leigh as the host. And yeah, thanks for listening.
No worries. Thanks for having me. It's really been great.
The Mentorlist specialises in interviews with top business minds. Gather their advice for your career. This is The Mentorlist.